even as you'll experience persecution from the world for living and sharing the gospel with it, God is sovereign over all of it. Which seems obvious enough to say, right? But I think we Christians forget about God's sovereignty, especially in those particular moments. It's occurred to you to share the gospel, but you're weighing whether or not it's worth what it might cost you here if you do. Now, we talk all the time about persecution from the world to silence Christians from sharing the gospel, but you cooperate with the world in silencing yourself from sharing the gospel. If it could cost you so do you silence yourself from sharing the gospel? If it could cost you anything from making, that uncomfortable, awkward feeling that we don't like making those awkwardnesses, or perhaps you're trying to avoid being slandered, or losing a relationship, or loss of a job, or you're trying to avoid being rejected, or yelled at, or hatred, or violence. Remember, in that moment, you're deciding if it's really worth making God's gospel available to others, that whatever the cost could be, God is ruling sovereign over all of it. In the same way he was ruling sovereignly when Jesus suffered to make God's gospel available to us. Just like he's ruling sovereign over the Iranian Christians experiencing persecution today. Right? Who's aware that the church in Iran, according to many missionary organizations, is the fastest growing church in the world today? Right? I didn't know that. I've just learned this. Surprisingly, it's not on the news. In 1979, there was only an estimated 500 Christians in the entire country. But within just the 4.5 decades since, today those estimates have climbed to somewhere from 500,000 to 3 million. I'm going to share one report of what's happening on the ground over there from the ministry Open Doors. Fatima had not long joined a new house church when the secret police raided one of their meetings. Coming together with Christians in Iran was always a risk, but this time their fears came true. We still can't forget the day when the police raided our house church, took some of us away, and forced us to sign a paper confessing we would never meet or engage in Christian activities again. They were tearing us apart one by one. And Fatima continues, the Iranian government strictly monitors and cracks down on Christian activities, making any attempt to share the good news a dangerous task. You never know if the person you approach will betray you or hand you over to the authorities. Believers also know that they could be turned in by suspicious neighbors and friends. In Iran, the government sees our faith as a threat. We live under constant surveillance and face different kinds of pressure. It's daily battle to keep our faith in such hostile conditions. But God is good. Now, if you're reading what I'm reading here, the two activities, as Fatima calls them, that to Iranian Christians are not optional, right? Totally non-negotiable, seem to be church and the gospel. Both just seem to be assumed and necessary and highly valued Christian practices. And persecution just being the expected cost to keep practicing them, to keep following Jesus. Jesus also having lived most of his ministry under persecution and threat, as Matthew records it as early as chapter 12. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. And then in chapter 21, now when the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parable, they perceived that he was speaking of them, but when they sought to seize him, they feared the multitudes. Right, so first it was just the Pharisees. Then it was the chief priests and Pharisees wanting to destroy Jesus, to seize, arrest, or take control of Jesus. And then in this morning's next Matthew passage, now it came to pass when Jesus had finished all these sayings that he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Then the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. Right, so now all the religious sects and leaders of Judaism, right, that were always competing with one another for dominance and power, are assembling here, cooperating together to plot how they will destroy Jesus, take control of Jesus, trick and kill Jesus. Which is how we know God was ruling sovereign over all of that. Because Jesus experienced it as God foretold it would in places like Psalm 31:13. For I hear the slander of many. Fear is on every side. While they take counsel against me, they scheme to take away my life. Right here, 1,000 years before Jesus was even born in a manger, God foretold here that Jesus would experience everything along the persecution spectrum from slander to death, revealing God was sovereign even over his persecution, which we also see here in our passage in verse 2, where Jesus says his enemies will have him crucified before verses 3 and 4 even happen, before his enemies have even assembled to begin planning it. Now, whether you call this prophecy or you call it God's foreknowledge, Jesus' other name in Revelation definitely points to God's sovereignty even over persecution. The Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Meaning, before they plotted against Jesus, before Jesus was born in a manger, even before David, Abraham, and Noah's flood, even before Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, even before Genesis 1:1, God had already determined his Son's suffering the cross, sovereign over all it would take to make God's gospel available to us. And knowing what it will cost you to make God's gospel available to others, he is sovereign over all you will suffer for him too. What will happen to you in the future as a result of your living and sharing God's gospel? Well, that's actually none of our business. That's actually God's business. Right? The future is God's responsibility. Living and sharing the gospel today, like our Iranian Christian brothers and sisters, that's ours. And any negativity you'll experience because of it, Peter says, don't worry about it. It's perfectly normal. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings. Right? So Christians experiencing persecution in whatever form you'll experience it, it isn't strange, but the normal byproduct of not silencing yourself from sharing God's gospel, of continuing to follow Jesus, of being a Christian. Now, Peter calls your persecution here a sharing in or partaking of his sufferings. And partaking communion with us this morning, you're not only identifying yourself as a follower of Jesus, you're identifying yourself with his mission, his suffering, and with the Iranian church and all the other Christians across the earth who ensure the gospel is being made available to everyone today. So please, as communion comes around and this song plays, remember the cross of Christ and what Jesus did to bring God's love to you, and whether or not you want to be a Christian. Because here in Canada, the costs are getting higher to keep following Jesus and bringing that same gospel love of God to others. So Zach and Rachel, will you come and serve us?